Sorry, interrupting you.
No problem. Yeah, so as I was saying, I'm going to present some of the work I've done as a postdoc at the University Autonomous of Madrid, where we developed a framework to use hand-in-hand acoustic data to produce species distribution models. So this work was published in Methods in Ecology and Evolution, and I'm going to also show you some of the follow-up work that we are working on at the moment today. So I first want to thank my co-authors on this paper, Diego Yusia, who was my supervisor in Madrid, Sarah Villen Perez, who initiated this work with Diego before I joined the lab, and also with Paolo De Marco and Juan Bertran and Rafael Marquez, who were Diego Yusia's PhD advisors. And so some of the data that I'm presenting was collected through Diego Yusia's PhD, and we're using it as a study case for showcasing our framework. And then funding. Yeah, just a quick note, if in case you have a question during the talk, or something doesn't really make sense, feel free to ask your question directly. I'm not looking at the chat, so just turn on your mic and ask your question. That's fine. And I think we should have a bit of time at the end for questions as well, if you prefer to ask it at the end. So it comes as no surprise for us that there is a lot of change going on the Earth, and humans are, imposing an unprecedented rate of change to many environments, and this goes mostly for land use and climate. And today I'm mostly going to talk about climate, but some of those ideas could apply to land use changes as well. And so what are the consequences of such global changes? There are distribution shifts, changes in phenology, changes in the species richness and abundance, with dramatic drops in numbers of birds and insects, among others. And so all of these changes really affect biodiversity dynamics. And so far, we are lacking that temporal aspect of biodiversity. So to quantify, understand, and predict these changes, we need data at high spatial temporal resolution. Good news is passive acoustic monitoring and ecoacoustic monitoring allowed us to get that high spatial temporal resolution. When using autonomous recorders, you can leave them out in the field for a long time, and that gives you a very, very specific, very precise temporal coverage. And then you can, of course, have a network of these recorders, and then you get a good spatial coverage as well. It's a method that's non-invasive. I'm probably not teaching you much, and it targets a diversity of behaviors and biological functions, among others, reproduction, territory defense, alert, foraging, and movements. So all of these functions are vital for animals, for their reproduction and for their fitness in general, so for the reproduction and the survival. And sound production is also highly sensitive to environmental conditions. So in this graph, you can see that out of all the potential environmental conditions in terms of here temperature, these frogs use only this gray area. So they only use a short or reduced range of conditions that are appropriate for them to call in. And ecoacoustics is a method that's emerging. There's since its conceptualization in 2015, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of articles published on the subject. And so the question I'm asking today is, can we use this ecoacoustic monitoring to forecast species distribution and the response of those of that distribution to environmental change. And so most of the time when we're looking at species distribution, we're looking at species distribution models. And there are two main approaches that are used for producing those models. The first one is probably the most used one, is the correlative models. It's models that simply relate environmental variables to presence, absence of the species of interest. But these models are based on presence, absence data, of course. So sometimes they're not fully accurate. For example, in case of sourcing dynamics, you could have presence of a species in a specific habitat, but actually that habitat is not really suitable for that species. It's just because they're migrating to that area, but they're not actually using it to reproduce or feed or anything. The other category of models is called mechanistic models, which are models based on processes. So it uses species-specific physiological data to build complex biophysical models. So it's really based on basically the metabolic rate of a species and its ability to acquire resources to survive certain temperatures. However, it's this kind of detailed physiological data is only available for a very limited amount of species. So that really limits the number of species that we can target with these types of models. So the idea here is to use ecoacoustics and acoustic monitoring to build species distribution models. So how can we build those? Would it provide a good compromise between correlative models and mechanistic models? Are these models robust? And what are their added value for predicting the impact of changes? So to answer these questions and to test this idea, we developed a framework that is a framework in 9 steps. So I'm going to go through all these 9 steps to just discuss the ideas and requirements for building such acoustic models. And then we'll go into some study cases that are using this framework to test, to predict the effect of climate change. So the first step is to select your study species. So of course, if you're making an acoustic model, you want to have a species that produces sounds, and that these sounds are related to vital functions like breathing, feeding, or navigation. These sounds should be species-specific signals. Of course, you want to make sure that you're targeting the right species and not, some other species that really sounds like the species you're working with. And also, you want to work on a species that has a clear taxonomic status, because of course, if it's not clear, maybe you don't have the the data on what sound it's producing. So the next step will be to select your monitoring sites. And so the idea is here for species distribution models is to have cross-site comparison along environmental gradients. One strategy which facilitates this is to target the climatic extremes of the distribution of the species of interest. So, for example, you select you look at the already described species distribution of your species of interest, and you will go target the 10% highest temperatures of or the 10% lowest temperatures, and that will give you populations that are very different in terms of their climatic requirements, and so that will help you down the line for building the model, for building a robust model. You also want, of course, your study species to be common at the site, or at least somewhat common, because if you're recording and you don't get any presence data, then that won't, give you much information about the conditions that this species requires to sing. You also want sort of good conditions in your site, so avoiding high noise, either coming from geophonic sources, like being near a river or in a very windy area, or also close to a city where you have a lot of noise coming from humans. But also consider other human disturbances that could affect the singing of the species in terms of timing. Like, for example, we know that birds tend to sing earlier in cities, so that would be a confounding factor for looking at conditions that are suitable for the species to produce sounds. And potentially it's good if it is somewhat accessible, because you're going to record for a long time, and so you want to make sure that you're able to go and maintain your recorders. So then the third step is collecting acoustic recordings. And so you want to get recordings over the whole breeding season. So starting a bit earlier than the usual start of breeding season and finishing after. The ideal situation is where you can record for a whole year, but it's not always possible. So the minimum is to record for a whole breeding season. And of course, you have to take into account that the breeding season might vary depending on where you are. Like if you're in, in the coldest area where the species live, probably the breeding season will be a bit delayed compared to where it's the hottest conditions. And so, of course, the best approach to do this kind of whole breeding season recording would be to use autonomous recordings that you can leave on site. You could of course do that in terrestrial environments as well as aquatic environments, marine or freshwater environments. The fourth step is to detect the acoustic activity. So of course, from your recordings, you want to extract the presence-absence data of your species of interest. And for that, the most viable technique would be to do automatic detection. Because you're going to record for a long period of time, you want to make sure that you're able to extract the presence-absence data on a timely in a timely manner. Step 5 is to compile the environmental information with environmental information. So you have spatial temporal data and you want to have current values and future predictions. So for example, for climate, you want to have the data for temperature on your sites, but also all over the distribution of your species. And you want to have those data, these data for the current values as well as for future predictions. If you're thinking of asking questions about, climate change, for example. You can also use environmental data on land use. And of course, you can either use already developed scenarios of changes for land use, or you could also use predictions that you come up with. And there are other data, other types of environmental variables that are interesting to take into account that are known to impact calling behavior, like photoperiod, for example. And I'm just showing you this two photoperiod aspects because we're going to come back to it later in the talk. But basically, you have two aspects to photoperiod. You have the day length, which is just like how long the sun is up, and that sort of goes up until the summer, and then at the summer it goes down again, and it's minimum during winter. Whereas you also have the other aspect is the photoperiod change, where it goes the day length changes a lot when it's at the minimum. And then it slows down and doesn't change much anymore when it's at the maximum. And so you have these two aspects that are slightly delayed in, or not in phase during the year, and that can be useful when to, for example, distinguish between fall and spring for some species, because the temperature, the conditions in terms of climate might be similar, but the photoperiod change is completely different. And the day length in spring and fall would be also similar. Okay, so step 6 is combining acoustic and environmental data sets. So basically the challenge here is to get the data to the same scale, because you have climate condition predictions and climate data that are usually yearly or monthly. There are some more recent models that predict climate daily, but it's still not super reliable, I guess. And then you have these acoustic data that usually are, hourly or even sometimes more. You have a higher temporal resolution on them, or you have daily data. And so the idea for this is to take the coarsest data and then transform your data. So for example, for the prediction of acoustic or calling behavior, you would take your hourly data and transform it into average monthly data. So there are many ways to do this. I'm using, in this framework, we're using one specific way where we basically take all the hours where there is some calling, and we divide it by the number of total hours, and that gives us about some probability of calling over the month. So the step 7 is to model environmental suitability for calling behavior. So once you have this these environmental data that is at the same scale as your acoustic data, you can relate calling behavior to current environmental conditions, or environmental conditions that are happening when the animals are calling. So in this framework, we've proposed 2 alternatives. One, which we call the regression model, where we relate activity probability to environmental data or variables. And one we call the boundary model, where we reconstruct an extreme month. That is basically, we take 30 days where the conditions are the most extreme, where there is some calling by the species. And then we consider that this is the upper or lower boundary for calling. And we compare this these calling boundaries to the environmental conditions at the time of the month. And so we look at the percentage of overlap between the conditions during a month and the extreme conditions that species can call in. Of course, there are other ways to model this suitability for calling. Here, for the regression models, we're using simple generalized linear mixed models, but you could possibly reconstruct the model the activity probability with GAMs, or I guess you could do even some kind of machine learning to learn the best environmental variables to predict the acoustic activity. So of course, this is one example in this framework, but there are others. Step 8 is important. It's to evaluate the performance of your model. So make sure that your model has a good relationship between the predicted data and the observed data. And for that, we propose to use cross-validation. So basically, we do several iterations of splitting the data, fitting the model, and then validating the model to compare, comparing on the validation set, the observed and predicted data. And so once you're sure that your model is robust, you can use the model to predict behavioral estimates at spatial temporal scales. So the idea is to use this model to predict suitability for calling in function of environmental conditions. And so you obtain maps, for example, here, monthly maps of the suitability for calling of the environmental conditions. And then you can use this model to predict and test, what happens if there is environmental change, and you can use any scenario for that. So here is what the overall framework looks like. And there is of course, more details in the paper. So for the study cases, the first study case is about the Iberian tree frog, Hyla morevi. So we looked at two populations at the temperature extremes of these frogs. And we monitored them in 2007 and 2009. When I say we, I actually mean Diego Yusia, and he's already published a few studies on this data, but we thought it was a very good data set to test our framework on. And so the first thing was to fit our model. And so we have on the first line, the regression model, and on the second line, the boundary model. So you have the calling probability in function of monthly temperature, monthly change in photoperiod, and monthly precipitation. So you see that there is a positive effect of monthly temperature, photoperiod, and a negative effect of precipitation. In terms of the boundary model, the idea is that it's sort of this square is the boundary, is basically the boundary of conditions that that are suitable for the species to call. And so we're looking at the overlap of the monthly conditions to those boundaries. Okay, so then we validated our both models, and we see that there is quite a high correlation between the predicted data by our models and the observed data. The red line here is the significance level for the correlation coefficients. So you can see that basically most of and these are I think are median and error bars, and so see that most of the iterations we've done on our data, the cross validation shows a positive correlation that is above the significance threshold, with a slightly better performance of the regression models over the boundary models. If we look at the predictions and the residuals between the predictions and the observed data, we see that mostly what happens is that the data is slightly over predicted for the hot population, and slightly under predicted for the cold population. And then we also looked at categorical validation, where instead of validating the predicted observed in terms of the suitability or the probability for calling, we just considered whether there was calling or not during the month that were predicted to have or observed to have calling or not. And so we also found very good results for this cross-validation, and also quite a better performance for the regression model than the boundary model. So here are the predictions for the current conditions. So you have an activity of this frog during mainly in the starting in the south, and then going northward and sort of eastward over the spring, and there is really no activity after June. Yeah. So then we also looked at the shift when we compare the future conditions with the current conditions. And we found just here, we only found an improvement of the calling probability in the future. And that is because, as we were looking at before, this species has a positive relationship between with temperature. So being a species that sort of likes the heat and the climate change predictions are, an increase in temperature that is positive or favorable for this species. And so you can see that there is more activity earlier during the season, and most of the change in activity will happen in March, April, May, and June when the species is active. So really, for this species, somehow climate change is advantageous. Another point that we looked at when we were thinking about comparing acoustic species distribution models with correlative species distribution models is how much coverage do we get for environmental conditions. And so here you see the range of temperatures that are covered by the acoustic aSDM for a regression model, for the boundary model, and then the correlative aSDM, which would look at, a range of temperatures that are annual. So the difference really between acoustic aSDMs and correlative aSDM is that you have this temporal dimension to acoustic aSDMs, which gives them a wider range of environmental conditions compared to these presence-absence correlative aSDMs. So the second study case, and this is some work in progress, is about 5 Iberian frogs. So we had, and the data that I just showed you for Hyla morelli is part of that 5 Iberian frogs. So you have 3 Alites and 2 Hyla species. And all of these populations were sampled by Diego at their climatic extremes on their species distribution. So you have the 2 points for Alites obstetricans, and then the 2 points for the second Alites species and the third. And same here for the first and second point for Gila Moleri and for Gila meridionalis. And we applied to these species acoustic monitoring data to climate change scenarios, which are scenarios that just came out between 2021 and 2022, which are called shared socioeconomic pathway. And so we took one that is, sort of quite optimistic, where people or the changes are made to become more durable as a society. And so this is the CO2 concentration under this first scenario, the SSP 126. And we took also the worst case scenario, where people continue to use or to increase their use of fossil fuels, and this is this scenario. And we used only the regression model because they are performing better, so that we thought no need to have many different predictions. So the first thing is we have our validation that is quite good for all of our species with just the highlight.
I think we have lost Camille. Is this just for me?
No, she's gone.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to continue her presentation? Just kidding. I'm sure she'll be back soon.
Yeah.
I'm curious how many, well, two questions that I've had that we can maybe think about. Are there lots of studies about how species change their calling behavior during droughts or during temperature extremes? Has anybody come across any studies like that?
We don't find, I mean, like, I work in a rainforest, so drought is relative. But there's not really that much of a like temperature was not a significant, had no significant effect on calling behavior in the lemurs we study. Rainfall did more so than temperature.
Mm-hmm.
But it also tends to be colder when it's raining. Like,
Right.
so.
Sure. And I was wondering if how much of this can be understood by comparing, for instance, for the lemurs, how many populations are you considering to draw these conclusions?
Well, I think Camille's back, so do we want to table that?
Sorry, my internet
Yeah.
just shut off.
Carly, we're going to save these questions for when you're presenting at Acoustic Methods. Don't worry.
Thanks. Was I gone for a long time or just?
I think about 3 minutes or 4.
Okay.
No, but I don't think there was a long time that you were speaking and we weren't listening.
Okay.
Yeah, we can tell you the last slide that we saw.
Okay.
We didn't see this one.
And this one?
This one we saw but didn't hear anything about.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so this one shows the validation for the 5 Iberian frogs. So we have quite high correlation coefficients between the predicted and the observed data over the significant threshold, except I think 1 or 2 points for these species. So the models are quite robust. And so if we look at the relationship between calling probability and different environmental conditions. So we have monthly temperature, precipitations, and then down here we have photoperiod. And depending on the species, it will be day length or monthly change in photoperiod. And that is because some species are active during the spring and some are active during the winter. And as I was showing you before, it's some because the day length and monthly photoperiod change are not in phase, they allow to distinguish better 2 seasons that might be very similar in terms of environmental conditions. Okay, so most of the species have a close relationship with temperature. You have here this one that has a very strong, optimal temperature. And then you have the species that we looked at previously that likes hot temperatures. Then for precipitation, there's quite a few that actually have negative relationships with precipitation, which is surprising because frogs usually like water, but maybe too much water is not great. And then really those will tell you what is the best period for them, for these species to be active in. So then if we look at the predictions and the mean calling suitability, we see that we have some species for which this doesn't change that much, except when the, so you have in blue, you have current, then you have the optimistic scenario, and then the worst case scenario. And so, of course, the worst case scenario has sort of somewhat an effect on most species, but in these 3 species, it doesn't have a very, very strong effect. You have one species that really loses with the potential changes, and one that really wins with those. And we can also look at the future suitability for all the sites, and we see that so anything that's below the red line is negative conditions, or the conditions will worsen, and anything that's above is better conditions. So really you see that for this species, most of the conditions will worsen, and for this species, most of the conditions will improve. Here we have annual mean activity over the distribution area of the species. You see that most of them are somewhat blue, so you have a negative impact of climate change, except of course for this species that is really winning again with climate change. And then we can also look at the phenology. So I'll run you through these plots because there's a lot going on. So we have the first line, we have the optimistic scenario, and the second line we have the worst case scenario. In blue is always current conditions, And then in here, on here, the points, the yellow points are the calling probability that we recorded in the hot population, and the calling in blue, the calling that we recorded in the cold population. So you can see that for some species, you have the area stays kind of the same, but then decreases maybe for the worst case scenario. If we look at the species that are most affected, you can see that clearly there's the circle becomes smaller for the future conditions. And then you can also see that the the season will start earlier, but finish much earlier as well. For the species where the conditions are improving, you have a bigger circle, and then the season starts earlier, and goes on and is more positive during until the end of the season. So in conclusion, we have a framework to explore the suitability for calling in space and time, which is new because usually we have only the space dimension. It allows for robust predictions, and we can look at species response to climate change. And in our case studies, we had mixed conditions where some species benefit from climate change, some aren't really affected, and some are badly impacted by climate change. We also have spatial shifts, mostly northward and towards mountains. Phenological shifts with earlier onsets and end of breeding seasons that are also earlier. And so as perspectives, I just want to go quickly over what I'm doing now at the University of Grenoble-Alpes in France. I'm setting up an acoustic monitoring network in the Alps. And so we have about 30 sites all over the Alps, and each site has about 5 to 10 plots along an elevational gradient, where so you have a lot of different environmental conditions along these gradients. And so this is really good for building these kinds of models. And we have also ecological data to combine, like the vegetation structure, the soil nature, and etc. And so my goal here is to make multi-species models using these data, where we're using some acoustic groups, environmental data, and potentially the interactions between the groups to model the acoustic activity in different parts of the Alps. And so, yeah, with that, thank you for your attention, and happy to take questions. I think I was a bit longer than I expected, sorry.
Yeah, Camille, thanks so much for this super interesting talk. And I think that we can have some minutes to open for for questions. Yeah, Carly, go ahead.
Hi, I don't know if I missed this, but what did you do this in R or Python, and what packages were you using for the models?
Yeah, good question. I haven't mentioned it. So the models were made in R, and all the code is available with the paper. So yeah, it's available.
Camille, I have a question about the representativeness of the populations that that were sampled in the extreme climatics. For instance, there's like 2 years, a lot of data, but from how many populations at each of the extreme climatics? What will be a good sample size to have a better understanding of how these populations respond on their different calling behaviors? But also, just to complement that, what if in the modeling approach, the binomial approach, what if the species don't really respond? What if to temperature variation, or there is a weak correlation, or where R squared? What is it then worth to model the calling behavior if climate really doesn't matter for the species?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. So in terms of spatial coverage, I guess the more the better. But of course, it has to be a compromise between, the amount of data that you can collect and the and what you need for your question. In this study, we have only 2 sites per species, which is quite quite low. But yet with this sampling, we are able to have quite robust predictions. So I guess at least 2. And if there are only 2, you really want them to be at the extreme of the climate conditions for the species. And then, of course, the second question about, of course, if there is no effect of climate on a certain species, there is really no point in making a model based on that. But a lot of there is so much effect of climate, like a lot of species are so dependent on the conditions to survive and to breed. So I would expect that most species have some kind of relationship with environmental conditions, except in environments where maybe the climate is very stable. But yeah, you want to make sure that these variables that you're looking at are meaningful for your study species.
Is this part of checking the assumptions of the correlation between the effect that you're treating and the calling behavior is a part on the framework that you presented, like when evaluating the model fitting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right.
you can definitely look at and the fit of the model won't be that good if the variables are not helping to predict calling behavior. Yeah.
Thanks.
Does anybody else have a question? Gio?
Hey, Camille, thanks so much. I was just wondering, kind of leading off of that question about spatial resolution for the sites that you select. Like, have you seen in maybe sites that you've done before with multiple points locally in the climactic extreme that changes the robustness of the data that you're collecting significantly? Or is it often the case that you have these climactic points of extremities throughout the map and just one acoustic monitoring site selected really intentionally is enough to get a robust data set? I'm just wondering, like, how much local variability there can be in these sites, and whether that warrants multiple monitorings even within close proximity to each other.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Unfortunately, we don't have the data to answer yet. yeah, I think this would be really interesting to investigate, is, how much you're adding to your model by adding sites. And I think also, when you have the possibility to target more than two environments, targeting along a gradient really helps you to better predict. I think to make better predictions. And of course, there's the idea that, if you're looking at several environmental variables, you want the extreme for those all those dimensions. So here we have the extreme for temperature, but it would be also interesting to have, extremes for humidity or precipitation, for example. So that would, each variable that you want to test, basically you would add more sites to cover that. But yeah, it's something that we're hoping to cover with, with the future data that we're collecting now, but we don't have an answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Anna's got a question about your recording strategy, or just some information about your deployment.
Yeah, that's a good question. So so about the acoustic monitoring, the recorders were left for a whole year, and sometimes more, and then they were recording all day long, like maybe I think 2 minutes per day. But this recording was done in 2007, between 2007 and 2009, during Diego's PhD project, and so they were using, I think, some like commercial recorders that were plugged in with like a clock or some kind. I can't really remember the exact brand of these, but they, it was before the wildlife audio moth era. So
wow, 2 minutes per day.
2 minutes per hour.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so 2 minutes per hour every hour for like a very long time.
Whoa. So it seems really doable to get started with this work. Like, ideally, you can set up recorders in some environmental gradient at the endpoints. And then you need some environmental data about whatever region that you're looking to model at decent resolution. But it's sort of encouraging that the bar is not super high, in terms of what data you might need to do this sort of distribution work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the only thing is really to really cover the whole breeding season, and like these little like 2 or 3 calls in the middle of like really outside of the breeding season. Those are interesting also because they are signs that the conditions are somewhat suitable for the species. Mm-hmm. So I would say most of the challenge will be to be able to maintain your recorders for a whole year, or a whole breeding season, rather than trying to cover as much field as you can.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. I guess it's, yeah, it's getting more and more feasible. So I'm looking at the chat. I see there is a question about how the recorders were supplied in energy. This I don't know. I know that now with the the recorders that are available actually to us now in commercially available, they can last quite a long time. Recording for 3 to 6 months on this kind of like 2 minute per hour schedule. So yeah. And then which frequency range? That's, yeah, same. The technical parts of the acoustic monitoring I don't really have because I didn't do the field work. It's in the paper though, but I think it was something standard like for 44,100 hertz. Yeah, and then I see a question about long-term data storage. Yeah, good question. This is something I think we need to address as a community, I guess. I don't know. It's really a tough question. Like, you keep it on servers or in hard drives. There's, I think we really need like a common, like a big server for storing this kind of data and sharing it openly. But it's very technically challenging, I think, and expensive. Yep.
Oh, one question I had, were you did you do any comparisons between the acoustic models and then other either regression or mechanistic models that used other types of data, so you could see how the acoustic distribution models compared with more traditionally generated models?
Yeah, we haven't done that. We've just like looked at the range of temperatures that you cover with different models. But then like the hard thing is like you can have presence absence of a certain species over a certain area, but then also you can, sorry, but then what's the ground truth, right? Like you can make a model with presence absence or a model with acoustics. What is the best ground truth? And I guess also the advantage of acoustic models or acoustic based models is really to have this temporal patterns. Like you can really see the seasonal changes. Mm-hmm. Whereas with presence absence, you rarely ever have, monthly data is really tricky to get when you're working with any kind of species that you have to go out in the field and get data on. So
anybody have some more questions? Okay, well,
there's just a comment by Carly saying that it would last.
Yeah, I just did some really quick, like back of the envelope kind of things based on your sampling schedule, which would have been like 48 minutes a day, 2 minutes every hour.
Yeah.
I was running mine continuously for 15 hours at like 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. And based on how long mine would last for 15 hours times like 2 to 3 weeks, that's like 210 to 250 hours that it would go for, which 48 minutes a day times a year is 290 hours. So, and that's just one set of like Energizer Ultimate lithiums. So the audio MOS would run kind of like one unit, and one battery set would actually get you pretty far given your sampling schedule.
Yeah, almost through the year. So
Yeah.
if you time it right, you could get through a breeding season. And then there's a question, the record.
I think recordings with rain or wind, did you manually screen them, or you had some automated process for screening those out?
I think they were we were looking at the conditions like rain, if there is heavy rain or things like that. But yeah, that's something I haven't done in the project either, so I'm not exactly sure how it was done. But I know that basically what the detection method that was applied was an expat in expat, and so they used like a template matching method, and then Diego went through all the detection and got rid of the false detection. So that's how they he did the detection. But yeah, I'm not sure that there was some pre-treatment for like heavy rain or heavy wind. I think there were, but not 100% sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Camille, for this really, really cool presentation. I'm curious if I can implement something similar in a field trip that I'm going on in a few months, now that I've seen this. And yeah, just so great to see you. And so in 2 weeks, we'll be meeting with Klaus Reed, who studies insects, and he's going to teach us why we should love and not hate insects in our passive acoustic recordings. So that should be a cool presentation. Mike, there is another suggestion for XBAT, which is in MATLAB with a template detector.
Yeah, that's what we used for the detection.
Okay. Well, great. Well, we'll see all of you soon. And Camille, just thanks again. And let's catch up soon sometime. It's great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you too. And thank you for inviting me. And thanks everyone for your great questions and attention.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.